Next, we'll have a report of findings on the Calhoun Cemetery Geophysical Survey by Natalie Robbins. She's the program manager with Vanderbilt Institute of Spatial Spatial Research. Oh, okay.
So while we're getting this set up, I think some of you know the backstory. We've included it in the director's reports, but we were contacted early last year by descendants from the Calhoun Cemetery who were concerned about some damage that occurred from a grading contractor working on an adjacent site. Henry Maxwell was planning to be here today, but they've had a death in the family, so he's not going to be here. But we have this recording through Metro Nashville Network that we'll share with the family so they can stay updated on the progress. I do want to note that the project, the funding came from the Preservation Society of Nashville for the GPR work that Natalie's team did, and the Nashville Historical Foundation funded the public presentation portion. So I know we've got David here. We can say thank you to him, but thank you also to our foundation as well. I think I'll go ahead and pass it over to Natalie from there.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and I've been lucky to work with Caroline the last couple of months on this project, and I'm excited to present some findings from this work to you all today. So my name is Natalie Robbins. I work for the Vanderbilt Institute for Spatial Research, or VISR. We're sort of a geospatial and geophysical consulting entity inside the Vanderbilt University umbrella. And so let's just jump right in. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Calhoun Cemetery, it's located just off of Nolensville Pike. So it's in a very busy area. It's situated between a shopping complex that's undergoing some extensive renovations and a used car lot. The site itself was deeded to the Lake Providence community in the late 1800s. Throughout its time as a cemetery, there's been several unhoused encampments that have been pretty common at the site, at least through the past 2 decades that we know of. Right now, as of this presentation, there's 100 memorials set for that cemetery on the Find a Grave site. So memorials is sort of a term that Find a Grave uses, where people can enter in who they believe to be buried there. And that number has changed throughout the 4 months that I've been working on this project, so there's constantly new memorials being added. And there's been several iterations of cemetery surveys done on this site, beginning in 1986 with the Fulcher tombstone inscriptions of Davidson County entries. At that point, they described 73 burials, 23 of which were unmarked, broken, or had no inscription. In 2003, the Davidson County Cemetery Survey saw 11 marked burials. So there were 9 that had inscriptions at that point and 2 that were broken but believed to be in place. And then the most recent iteration of the County Cemetery Survey noted 10 marked burials. And this is just a map of the 2003 cemetery survey. So you can see here's the 11 marked burials, sort of drawn to scale roughly when that cemetery survey was conducted. So now I'm just going to go over a couple of tools and methods that are used for this type of work. So the first is RTK, GNSS, GPS. So we use MLID, real-time kinematic, global navigation satellite system, base and rover setup. So that's a big mouthful. Essentially, it just means that we've got a base station that's set up in a stationary location within the cemetery, and it establishes sort of a local datum. So it averages from all of the satellites it's talking to and says, okay, here's my place in the world. And then it uses that place to communicate with a rover that we can use to take precise GPS measurements of where we're working. The next tool, the most important tool, is the ground penetrating radar. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with ground penetrating radar or have gotten to see it in action. We get a lot of like, are you mowing the lawn with the world's fanciest lawnmower? So this is an example of kind of how the ground penetrating radar works. So you push it over the surface that you're surveying and it sends a radar pulse down into the earth. And this is reflected back up into the instrument. And those reflections are what we're gathering to find out some information about what's underground. So this is a non-invasive technique. We're not disturbing anything at a site like this. So that's why it's really crucial for this type of survey work to be done at cemeteries. And how fast these reflections kind of travel back tells us something about the geophysical difference underground. So the difference between our ground soil and maybe metal, water, a potential burial, an air gap, things like that. So we're leveraging those differences to find out something about what's underneath the Earth's surface. So essentially, when the GPR encounters a feature like it does here in this animation that has a different geophysical makeup than it is reflected back, and we observe that as a hyperbola. So a lot of the time when we're looking at these GPR results, we're looking for different hyperbolas, and the hyperbolas tell us something about what is underneath the surface and how it is different from its surrounding soil matrix. There's a bunch of different ways that we can see sort of these differences in GPR data, especially in terms of adaptations for cemetery surveys. So you can see if there's sort of a wrapped burial that's not a coffin burial, the GPR reflects off of that, and it might be sort of a weaker, kind of smaller hyperbola. But if we're looking at a coffin burial, we can sometimes leverage the air gap in between where someone is buried, and that has a very distinctive reflection on a ground penetrating radar. And so oftentimes what we're looking for here is things like grave shafts, where a coffin or vault might be, patterns of anomalies. Patterning is a big kind of part of what we're looking at when we're interpreting these types of data, air gaps, changes in composition of the soil because of how it's filled in. And then any surface features, obviously, and those will also show up on a ground penetrating radar survey. So when you survey with GPR, you are collecting the data in what's called transects, so different lines of data. We can stitch those together and we can create depth slices or amplitude slice maps that kind of give us a look under the surface at each of these depths. And we can process this in a software called Radan or other types of geophysical survey processing platforms. And so in order to interpret the data, we will look at both these depth slices, so these kind of holistic views, as well as time slices or reflection profiles, which are kind of like a peek at each of the transects individually. And this is just an example of kind of how burial reflections sometimes look on ground penetrating radar time slices. So these are just peeks into each of the transects. And you can see where these hyperbola features are indicative of different types of burials, whether they be metallic coffins, wooden coffins. There's a lot of different ways to be able to view these types of reflections. And these are just some examples from assorted publications of other colleagues who have worked on this type of project. And as I said, a lot of, sort of interpreting this is looking for patterns of anomalies. So as you can see, these are a couple of examples from other cemetery projects where you're looking for patterns that are persistent and might look for burials that are in a row. And one thing to note is that we don't always see these sort of reflections at the depths that we expect, especially with historic cemeteries. So there's sort of that 6 feet under colloquialism, and that's not necessarily true, especially in some of these older historic cemeteries and in cemeteries where, they've been around for a long time and they might have experienced things like erosion or flooding that could have taken off some layers of soil that we wouldn't be necessarily accounting for when we're doing a survey like this. So now I'm just going to briefly expand on our geophysical survey collection process. So the first thing is just determining where we want to survey. This was an easy part of this project because we already knew where the cemetery was and sort of the general extent of where marked burials were. But you can also look at historic maps, LiDAR, which is what this image is an example of, and talk with the community, which we did ahead of this survey. The next step is to conduct a surface survey, so very similar to how the surface surveys are being conducted for the Davidson County Cemetery Survey. We brought out our RTK GNSS GPS, mouthful, and located features of interest, specifically around marked burials, field stones, depression, vegetation changes like vinca, and any other features of interest when we were out there. From there, we set up our grids strategically across the site of interest and then surveyed in our GPS points. So these are the grid extents for the Calhoun Cemetery. You can see there's a section kind of in the middle where we broke up our large grid 1 because it's on a bit of an incline. So we just sort of bisected that, but then we're still able to collect an area where there was a large coagulation of marked burials with our grid 4. And then it's time for the action. So this is what the ground penetrating radar looks like. This is a GSSI 350 megahertz ground penetrating radar with a 3-wheel buggy for all-terrain usage. And we bring the ground penetrating radar out, we set up a grid and then mark it off at half-meter intervals and survey sort of every half meter starting at the quarter meter, and move in a zigzag format or unidirectionally, just depending on the landscape of the site that we're looking at. And we typically move from north to south to bisect any sort of east-west facing burials. So at this site, we were doing a zigzag format, so we would start in one corner and move up and down like this to survey the entirety of the survey grid. And this is actually us out at the site, the Calhoun Cemetery. I can't remember, David or Caroline, if one of you took this photo, but thank you for that. And then once the fun part, sort of the actual survey work is done, we come back into the lab and we post-process the data in different software platforms in order to generate those depth slices, which I mentioned, and also to view the time slices and create our interpretations of the site. And then the last step in some cases is to come back out and mark where the potential unmarked burial locations are with the GPS so that we can go back to those locations if needed later and start to see some of the patterning potentially between these unmarked burial features at a site. So this is what you guys are all waiting for, the results. So the first results we'll talk about is just our surface survey. If you scan this QR code, you can go to an interactive map where you can click on each of these features and see an image associated with them. But we documented 13 monuments with readable inscriptions. There were 10 depression features, 4 broken or unreadable monuments, 2 concrete markers, 2 potential field stones. And then we had 2 features that we sort of dubbed as grave boxes. Even from the surface, when you walked across these features, you could tell that there was something extremely substantial at this location, but there was no associated marker with them. And they showed up extremely intensely in our data, and I'll show you some examples of that. And then along with that, we also surveyed in where all the tree locations were. So one of the biggest difficulties with this type of work is comparing what a burial-like anomaly looks like compared to a tree root. Sometimes they can look sort of similar and they can be at similar depths. So it's advantageous to know where all the trees are that are located within our survey grids so that we can then go back and say, are we seeing something that's actually indicative of a burial, or is this very likely to be associated with some sort of tree root system? And so this is just a sampling of the 13 legible monuments that we were able to document, and all of these are in that interactive app where you can click and then just see what the image associated with them is. Many are in very good shape. Some are broken but likely to be in place, and some have kind of been disturbed due to tree growth. One thing that was extremely interesting is we did find a burial, and it's highlighted as this yellow marker on the map for Amanda Catherine Baker, and it's one of the older inscriptions at the cemetery. 1866 is what we believe the death date for this was, and it was not documented in any of the previous surveys or on Find a Grave. So this is one that we really wanted to kind of highlight because it's one that's not necessarily been documented in good faith, and it was in an area of the cemetery where it would have been pretty grown up at most times when these cemetery surveys were being done. And we had the advantage that this cemetery survey was done at the very, very end of November. So it was after there was a bit of dieback on the vegetation, which makes it a lot easier to find these features and also easier for us to survey to push the GPR. So that time of year is really ideal for this type of work. And so we were lucky that this marker was able to be discovered during that time. And this is just a closer up view of the marker itself and where we believe the death date is 1866. And there are other Baker descendants buried in the cemetery, so it does track that this would be associated with that family sort of individuals. Also, when we were out there, the burial of John I. Blackman, who was a child who passed away, had some features surrounding it that we believe may be grave goods. So there was a typewriter, a few suitcases, and some other features that were surrounding his burial that we had to avoid when surveying in this area. In looking at and interpreting the data, which takes a little bit of time, it takes us time to go through each of the time slices and the depth slices to get sort of a holistic view of what features we're looking at the cemetery. We found 62 anomalies associated with burials. 10 of those 62 were associated with marked burials that we knew were at the site. We believe there might be at least 2 stacked burials, sort of in the middle of the cemetery. And the burial features that we were observing were concentrated in sort of the middle portion of the cemetery parcel. So this blue outline here shows the full extent of the Calhoun cemetery parcel. And kind of in that central portion is where we were seeing all of these burial reflections. And this is just a little bit better, more zoomed in view, so you can kind of really see where the conglomeration of these features is. And many of the marked burials are also kind of concentrated in that grid 4, which is where we had found many of the surface features. So these are looking at some depth slices of data. So this is grid 4, where we were seeing the highest density of potential burial features. 24 centimeters is a pretty shallow depth slice, so we're not seeing too much there of interest. That sort of circular feature that you see up at the top of figure A is likely associated with a tree. So they show up on our profiles, and as we dig down a little bit deeper, that's when we start to be able to tease out the difference between a tree and a potential burial. But what I want to draw your attention to is on figures B and C, there's a cluster of really high amplitude features. And these are associated with several marked burials that we know there. And then also those 2 grave box features, which I said you could really distinguish when you were walking on them at the surface. They showed up as extremely high amplitude features on this grid. And as you go down a little bit deeper, you start to see that there's even more burials that are kind of associated in that cluster. And remarkably, also on sort of the southern side here, a reflection that corresponds with a marked burial that was being displaced by a tree. So this is one of those marked burials that we had. It's hard to know oftentimes if monuments are leaned against a tree, if it's actually associated with the burial location or if it's potentially just been moved to try to protect it. But in this case, we do believe that this marker may be indicative of the burial location of Josephine Hill. And then these are the stacked burial features that I mentioned. So this is a better close-up of them looking at grid 1B. So they were persistent in both grid 1B and 4 because we collected data in that location twice with 2 different grids overlapping. And this is what they look like on the time slices. So you can see they're very high amplitude. They're very intense. We're not going to miss those on our interpretations of these features. And you can see where there are 2 very distinctive hyperbolas there. Looking back at grid 4 again, in that area where we saw that high cluster of features, there was a lot of Pratt descendants that were buried in this area. So you can see that if we look at the time slice profiles, when we're rolling the GPR unit across these features, when we intercept this sort of flat marker here, you can see that as a surface feature in our depth slices at first. And then there's a high amplitude feature that is just sort of to the north of it when we're rolling our GPR across it. And that is likely associated with a different burial. So the marker's here, there's another burial here. When we come back the other way, so we're zigzagging back, we again encounter this high amplitude feature, so it's in multiple depth slices, which gives us more confidence that this is indeed potentially a burial feature. And then we roll back across and we're likely crossing where the actual burial for Mary Pratt Whitlow is on that second time slice there. So you can see the high amplitude feature, Mary Pratt Whitlow's burial feature, and then potentially another unmarked burial feature. And they're all kind of consistent in a row there, which also leads cadence to the fact that these are potentially burial features. And just like we sort of saw before with some examples from the literature, here's a smattering of examples of potential burial reflections from the Calhoun Cemetery across all of the different grids. So they look similar, but a little bit different in kind of each part. And that may have to do with a lot of different factors, especially how people were buried, what type of burial they had. So if they're in a metallic coffin, a wood coffin, different things like that. The time frame in which they were buried, so how deep they were dug down would be different potentially based on their interment date. So lots of different reasons why you're seeing things that look very similar but also a bit different. One thing that I do want to point out is sort of in the southernmost extent of the cemetery, there was a marker for a Mrs. Lizzie Pratt Petway. And that had been disturbed during some grading work that was being done when the shopping center has been updated just to the other side of the cemetery parcel. And we did conduct extensive ground penetrating radar survey over in this area. And although we do see marked locations for burials, we don't see any evidence of burial-like features in this grid. So it's very possible that maybe this marker was moved at a time in which, this cemetery has undergone a lot of disturbance just due to unhoused encampments. So it's possible it could have been moved, or this burial was conducted in a way that wasn't conducive to be able to pick up on ground penetrating radar survey. But we notably didn't see any other burial-like features in that entire grid. So preservation recommendations, if possible, and if it was applicable to the descendants community, maybe installing some fencing around where we know the marked burials are, just to keep out some of these encampments and preserve the locations that we do know. And then we did go back out to the site and mark all of these unmarked burial locations. There were 52 total locations that we marked with wooden stakes. So those will be a temporary solution, but placement of these low profile permanent markers would definitely be recommended. We've worked at several other cemeteries, one specifically in Rock Island, Tennessee, and they were able to get these markers inscribed with information about the cemetery, the date of survey that is associated with that potential marker, and then they labeled them with a numeric system that they could tie back to where the GPS locations are. And you just place these, you place a piece of metal rebar in the ground and then knock these in on top of it, and they become extremely low profile so you can continue to mow over them, which makes them a lot easier to have in a cemetery site like this. So I just want to thank our funders again for this, their support on this project. It wouldn't be possible without the Preservation Society of Nashville and the Nashville Historical Foundation. Thank you so much for supporting this crucial work. And then also just a special thanks to my colleague Stacy Curry Johnson at Vanderbilt Libraries, who came out and was able to help me survey the cemetery on sort of last minute notice when I had a family emergency at the end of last year. Adam Fracchia and Caroline Eller at Metro Historical Commission for their help on this project throughout. Mr. Maxwell, a descendant of the Calhoun Cemetery, who gave us crucial sort of background information and was available for questions along the way. And David Greider, who has provided us many other occasions to talk about this type of work, most notably at our event last month called Beneath Nashville that we held at Sunnyside. And with that, I'll open it for any questions that you might have about GPR in general, the cemetery, all of that. Yeah.
Who owns the property?
I believe it's owned by the Descendants Group.
And when was the last burial, and is it open for additional burial?
Is it open for additional burials?
I think they still could bury people there under the state cemetery laws. There's nothing keeping them from doing so. The descendants have considered potentially turning the property over to be cared for by a local church, but I haven't heard anything definitive in that direction.
I believe the last burials were in the late 60s, early 70s.
Like.
Yeah, so it's been a while since there's been a new interment there. But they range sort of from 1866, which you saw that extremely early burial, to like late 1960s, early 1970s.
One more question. Who keeps the property up?
I believe they pay for the church to do the descendants community pays for the church to do the mowing, correct?
Yeah, it's my understanding is the descendants, and then they're working with that church as well, and they're trying to find sort of a long-term solution because the descendants are sort of aging out and they're not able to actually physically care for the site themselves anymore. tell you off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and see. It may be late, it may be
Yeah, I
Lake
think it's
Providence.
Lake Providence, yeah.
But I didn't want to commit to that without being
So
sure.
if it's like, would you consider this an African-American cemetery?
Yeah, it most
Yes.
definitely is a historic African-American cemetery. And I believe the church used to be co-located with where the cemetery was or very close by, but has since been relocated, which seems to be sort of typical of sites like this where the church would be co-located and then at some point is relocated and then a bit of kind of that back and forth connection is broken.
That makes total sense now, thank you.
Yeah.
Which Mr. Maxwell is it?
Carolyn?
Henry Maxwell, okay. I just thought that name should be in there since there are several Maxwells who I am indirectly related to.
I had a question about the one that the woman, is it Anna Catherine, who shows up, but, so there's she didn't show up on any of the previous surveys.
Oh, yes, yeah. The marker for her.
Did the radar show there is somebody there?
It doesn't show that there's an individual buried there. There's an individual buried just to the left. So if you see this map, there's sort of a cluster in grid 1A. That's where her burial, her monument was located. There is one that is sort of that bottommost potential burial is associated with the tree features there, but I don't know that it's necessarily associated with her burial. It's not co-located enough that I would 100% concretely say that's her potential burial location. I think it's honestly pretty likely that that monument is not intact in its original location. I believe it might have been relocated there.
Well, because what I wondered about is, and I feel like I might be making this up, but I thought there was something about when it says in memory of, that they're not necessarily buried there.
Yeah,
That it's a family, other family members are, but then they wanted to commemorate her somehow. Does this ring a bell to anybody? Or do you see people buried there with in memory of?
Carolyn, do you have
That
any
was the
light
part
from your
that
cemetery surveys?
threw me.
I know what you're talking about. I haven't necessarily, the look of this one to me isn't necessarily that of a memorial marker.
Okay.
But I do agree with you that, I mean, it's kind of behind a tree on that northernmost property line. It's an area that our volunteers certainly wouldn't have ventured into. So I think it's very likely it could have been relocated from somewhere else.
Gotcha.
There are examples of that, in doing my research.
City cemetery.
His daughter was buried in Knoxville, but there's a thing that says, it says she's buried in Knoxville, but it's on their family plot.
Or abroad, or, missionaries or any number of things.
There's a marker out at City Cemetery, Brian knows about it, for Governor Sevier, and he's not buried there. He was buried in Alabama, and then in, I think it was 1890s, they dug him up and put him on the front lawn of the Knox County Courthouse.
Yeah, and I know that is typical in some locations. And like I said, I don't necessarily think there's a burial features that's coagulated, that corresponds with that. But I think it's important to note and potentially do a little bit more research because other descendants of that individual are buried at the Calhoun Cemetery. So it leads credence to the fact that that person could potentially be buried here. And there could be a sort of an older part of the cemetery that we maybe have yet to discover.
It appears that there's an area at the rear of the parcel that I guess is too heavily wooded for any kind of GPR work or anything.
Yeah, so the front part of the parcel is where we elected. So here's that grid extent map. So the back part of the parcel there was unsuitable for survey because it is extremely heavily wooded and there's lots of vines and it wouldn't be suitable for this type of work because we'd have to stop and start every couple of minutes or seconds even. But if that were to be thinned out, it could be surveyed and certainly should be surveyed before anything would be done with the property. That just because we didn't survey there doesn't mean that there's absence of data there. It's just that it was unsuitable for survey at the time that we were conducting this survey work.
And do you have any historical documentation of burials there?
None of the maps that I've seen have indicated anything there. The only map that I have seen is this map right here, which was the 2003, and it sort of you get like a general scale from it, and like I know where it is in time and space because I know where some of these where these marked burials are. But allegedly in the 1986 Fulcher original volume 4, there was a plat map that was created of the cemetery, but in the revised version, which is the version that I've been able to get my hands on through TSLA and Nashville Metro Archives, there's no plat map in there. But understanding what I do about the Fulcher books, when he said plat map available, he had drawn a plat map. So I believe that when he did some edits to this entry, he accidentally left off the plat map in the newest version, but I haven't been able to see an unedited version of that volume 4. So if that exists out there, it would be prudent to get to see that map, because I think that would be the most complete map of the cemetery and would give us the best idea. And the maps that are created in that Fulcher survey seem to be very much to scale. So I think we could get a lot of information from that map, if it does exist.
20th century at least, or late 19th, graves should correspond to burial information on death certificates, shouldn't they?
Yes, and I think that's a lot of the work that Caroline has been doing has been to correlate those types of data, and then that data is also correlated in many of the Find a Grave memorials.
I see. Thanks.
But they wouldn't necessarily give an exact location of where that burial is, just a general kind of idea. Yeah.
Wrong button. You described concrete crypts. Are you talking covered with concrete or just outlined with concrete?
They're underground, so they are potentially concrete lined or metallic lined, and those are those grave box features. So when you're walking out there, you're walking and you can all of a sudden sort of understand that there's a difference in the soil matrix because something very hard is only a few centimeters under the surface here. So it could be that somebody was buried and then they had a concrete lining or that went across their burial and then somehow that's grown over. It could also be that they had pretty extensive metallic coffins that are showing us those features. And so there's kind of a couple different avenues there, but it would be hard to know without doing invasive investigation. And I think the one thing that I want to stress with this is we have high confidence that these burials are potentially located in these locations, but the only way to 100% know would be to excavate in those locations, which is not the goal of this survey. And ground penetrating radar gives us a general idea of what could be under the surface, but it's not 100%. And we can't 100% concretely say something is under the surface with these non-invasive techniques.
Are there any other questions?
It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time and thank you for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.